All right, so today we're diving into something that's got everyone in Canada talking gun control. Specifically, the government's new firearm ban and buyback program.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's really interesting to see Canada kind of doubling down on what they started back in 2020,
Hmm.
adding a ton of new models like 324 to the list of prohibited firearms
Right, plus they're finally launching that buyback program we've been hearing about forever.
for years. Yeah.
So we've been digging through a ton of sources on this, and, well, let's just say it's complicated. The big question everyone's asking is this really going to make Canada safer?
And our sources show there were some pretty strong opinions on both sides of that question.
For sure. So let's break down what this ban actually means, like practically. We're talking about adding 324 new firearm makes and models to the prohibited list, which is on top of the, what, over 1,500 that were already banned back in 2020.
Right.
That's a lot. We're talking about something like 14,520 firearms that are now affected by this.
And it's not just a little thing either. These guns, you can't use them, you can't sell them, you can't import them.
You can't even really move them around without a ton of restrictions. It's a pretty serious clampdown.
Yeah, it is.
Now imagine, right? You're a gun owner. Maybe you're out in rural Alberta and hunting's a huge part of your life.
Right.
Maybe it's something that's been passed down through your family. And all of a sudden, the rifle you've been using safely and responsibly for years, well, now it's banned.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, that's the problem right there. They see this as the government overreaching, punishing the people who are following the rules, the law-abiding citizens.
And they're not really getting at the root of the problem, which is, criminals aren't just going to suddenly decide to hand over their guns.
Exactly. They're going to find a way around it, like they always do.
That's what one of our sources, James Moore, he's a former conservative cabinet minister, was saying. He's really skeptical of this whole thing. He's saying it's like putting a Band-Aid on a huge wound. You got to address the bigger issues.
Moore really thinks we need to be going after things like organized crime and gangs, and also looking at mental health challenges.
Yeah.
He sees those as the driving forces behind gun violence, not so much the guns themselves.
Right. And he also pointed out that the buyback program itself has been really messed up, like with delays and stuff. It was promised ages ago. And even now, they don't have clear rules about how they're going to value these firearms.
Yeah, it's like, how do you even put a price on something that's been basically unusable since the 2020 ban?
Exactly. It makes you wonder how serious they really are about making this program work. Will people actually go along with it? Will they get a fair deal? It's just a lot of unknowns.
It definitely raises a lot of questions about whether the government's really thought this through.
And the government's pushing this ban as a way to get these, quote, dangerous weapons off the streets. That definitely resonates with a lot of people, especially those in cities who are more likely to see gun violence up close.
For sure.
But it's also really alienating the folks who feel like they're being targeted unfairly.
And it's important to remember, even with the 2020 ban, gun violence actually went up. Like, firearm-related violent crimes increased by 9% in 2022.
That's wild.
Yeah, over 14,000 incidents. It really makes you wonder if just taking guns away without addressing the deeper societal issues is actually going to change anything.
It's like squeezing a balloon on one end, the air just goes somewhere else. So how do we make sure we're keeping people safe, but also respecting the rights of gun owners who are doing everything right?
That's the big question. And honestly, it's not an easy one to answer. We need to be looking for solutions that are effective and fair.
Solutions that get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And to do that, we have to be willing to look at this whole issue in a really nuanced way, move past all the rhetoric and sound bites.
Okay, so we've talked about the specifics of the ban, the issues with the buyback program, and we've heard from folks who support it and folks who are against it. But there's another wrinkle here we need to talk about, the international angle.
Oh, right. The government's idea about sending some of these banned guns to Ukraine.
Yeah, that one's causing a lot of controversy.
It has, yeah.
We'll get into that more later on. But it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. It just shows you how messy this whole thing is.
Yeah.
We're talking about what happens here in Canada, but also like international stuff, people's rights, and trying to keep everyone safe. It's a lot.
It really is. So let's focus back on Canada for a minute.
Hmm.
One of our sources pointed out this weird thing. Shootings are actually going up in some cities.
Really?
Yeah, like Toronto, for example, even though they already have pretty strict handgun laws.
That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? If the laws are already strict, how come there are more shootings?
Exactly. It seems like the guns themselves might not be the whole problem.
Right. This source was saying it's got to do with organized crime and gangs getting more powerful.
Like, those groups just don't care about the laws. They're gonna do what they want, regardless.
That's what they're saying.
So maybe instead of focusing on the guns themselves, we should be looking at why these groups want them so badly in the first place. Like, what are they trying to do?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about stopping the guns from getting in. It's about understanding why people want them.
Right. And that probably means taking a look at some bigger problems like poverty and inequality.
Absolutely. The source was saying that when people don't have opportunities, when they don't see a good future for themselves, they're more likely to get involved in crime.
Especially young people, if they feel like they've got nothing to lose, they're more likely to take risks,
Exactly. So instead of just punishing people, maybe we need to invest more in communities, give people better options.
like job training, mentorship programs, stuff like that.
Right. Things that give young people hope.
So, coming back to the buyback program, the government's selling this as a way to make the streets safer, get rid of all the dangerous guns. And that makes sense. People want to feel safe, especially in the cities where you hear about gun violence more often. But it seems like this approach might actually be pushing away the gun owners who are already doing everything right.
Yeah, I can see that. Our sources were talking about how a lot of gun owners are really worried about this whole thing. They use their guns for hunting or target shooting, stuff that's a big part of Canadian culture.
Especially in rural areas, it's like a way of life for some people.
Right. And they feel like they're being punished for something they didn't do, like they're
Yeah.
being lumped in with the criminals.
So we're back to that question of balance, aren't we? How do you make it harder for criminals to get guns without taking away the rights of responsible gun owners?
Yeah, that's the tough part. Honestly, I don't think anyone has a perfect answer. It's something that governments all over the world have been struggling with for a long time.
It seems like the best way forward is to just keep talking. Listen to what everyone has to say, try to understand all the different sides.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to find a way to work together on this.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, a Canada where everyone feels safe.
Okay, so we've talked about the ban, the buyback program, and the different perspectives on this issue. But let's get back to that thing we mentioned earlier, the possibility of Canada sending these banned guns to Ukraine.
Oh, right. That's a whole other can of worms.
It really is. The government's idea is that these guns could be used by Ukrainian soldiers in their fight against Russia. But there are a lot of people who don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's pretty controversial.
Like we were saying before, James Moore is totally against it. He says these specific guns wouldn't even be useful in a war.
Right, and he's not the only one who thinks so. There are a lot of logistical problems, too. Like, do they even have the right ammo for these guns in Ukraine?
And even if they do, Ukrainian soldiers are already trained to use different kinds of weapons. Teaching them how to use a whole new set of guns in the middle of a war, that could actually make things worse.
It could, yeah. So it makes you wonder if this is more about Canada wanting to look like they're helping Ukraine rather than actually doing something that's useful.
Right. Like maybe it's more about appearances than actually making a difference.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to think about. International politics are always complicated.
They really are. And this whole thing raises another question. If these guns aren't good enough for the Ukrainian army, what happens to them? Are they going to be destroyed, just stored somewhere?
Those are good questions. We need to know what the plan is. The government needs to be transparent about this whole thing.
Yeah, they got to be upfront about what they're doing and why. They can't just pass a law and then wash their hands of it.
Exactly. They need to have a real plan in place, one that takes into account all the possible outcomes.
And they need to be willing to adjust that plan if things change. This is a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
You got that right. We need to be humble about this, admit that we don't have all the solutions, and we need to focus on doing what's best for all Canadians.
No matter where they live or what they believe.
Exactly.
After all that, it still feels like we've barely scratched the surface here.
Right. This is such a big issue with so many angles.
It's easy to get caught up in the policy stuff and the numbers, but we gotta remember this is about real people. Real people who are affected by gun violence every day.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important to remember that human side of things.
So as we're wrapping things up here, I think we should keep those individual stories in mind. Those are the ones that really matter.
For sure. We want to build a Canada where everyone can feel safe, where parents don't have to worry every time their kid goes to school, where communities can thrive without this fear of violence.
Yeah, that's a future worth working towards. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of work, and we got to be willing to change our minds sometimes, be open to new ideas.
And maybe we can even learn from what other countries are doing. Some places have tried some pretty interesting approaches to gun control and have had some success with it. It's worth looking at what they've done.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, as we finish up this deep dive, I hope you'll keep thinking about these things. Keep asking those tough questions about what we can do to make Canada safer. Because this conversation isn't over, it's just getting started.
And that's really the biggest thing I want you to take away from this. Don't just listen to this and then forget about it. Let it spark something in you. Get involved, speak up, learn more about this issue. Even small actions can make a difference.
So, we've taken a deep dive into Canada's firearm ban and buyback program. We've looked at the arguments, the challenges, the different perspectives. And I guess the biggest question that remains is if this isn't enough, what else can we do? What other solutions are out there? What can we do in our own communities?
Right. What can we do as individuals?
I hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some ideas to explore, because creating a safer Canada, that's something we all have to work on together. Thanks for joining us.